It's really good to see you guys. Why don't I'm going to start with maybe 15 to 20 minutes to kind of look at the context of what we're working under. And I'll use my experiences as the micro to kind of pull out to the macro. And hopefully, kind of let you know some of the things. I'm sure you've already gone through it, particularly the women, what things may come your way. We use this phrase, hold the line, and it came from, drawing a line of who you are. I call it our values, your value system, where on this side, you're good. And when you cross, you're evil, right? It's got to be that clear in your head. And it was great advice by, one of my mentors when I was still in college actually told me that. Make that line very clear so that when you have power, when you make decisions, you're very clear about why you do something, right? So let me start with this, which is really, what are we dealing with? And I think as a journalist today, our biggest problem is trust. And most news organizations sit there and they kind of like, especially Western news organizations, they turn themselves into pretzels because they keep saying, well, how do we build trust? Well, it ain't the old world. And that's what I hope you'll take out of this, because in the end, trust is not ours to actually build anymore, because the distribution powers, our gatekeeping role as journalists has been taken away from us. And the group that has taken over that is the technology, our technology companies and the engineers have essentially abdicated responsibility. When I say gatekeepers in the public sphere, right? Because journalists, I became a journalist because I knew information was power. And it was deeply connected to a sense of justice. So this is what we did in Rappler. Was we have 3 pillars. I'm sure Mara has told you about this. The side where I spend my time based on these 3 pillars, technology, I now put it as number 1. If you're a journalist and you don't understand technology, get on it, because this is not only the game changer in our public information ecosystem, it determines whether or not humanity can still have a shared reality. So technology, journalism. Why are journalists different from content creators? Because we have to have the courage to speak truth to power. We have to do the things that no one wants to do, not in real life, right? Who wants to go up to a Goliath and tell him that he's evil, or something simple? Who wants, in my case, in the Philippines, a question I thought about, and then I wound up asking anyway from President Duterte, is his presidential style. It's very clear that he uses violence as part of a leadership style. And I asked him that, do you need to have violence? And he answered, right? Because if you never ask the question, you'll never get the answer. The worst journalist is the journalist who thinks about it but doesn't have the courage to ask. Journalists protect the facts. And then finally, here's the third part that most Western news organizations forget. What is the role of journalism? It's community, right? In the old days, when information didn't move as fast, the facts, our stories provided communities the facts so they could decide how to be, what actions they needed to take, whether it's in your apartment building, in your HDB, or whether it is in your town or in your nation. So these are the 3 pillars that are critical for me. The problem we face is very simple, and it actually took I quote this American biologist all the time. His name is E.O. Wilson, and he said this a long time ago, but it's the truest today, which is, what is the crisis we're facing? It's our Paleolithic emotions, our medieval institutions, and our godlike technology, right? We're being manipulated emotionally by the platforms that carry information, right? When the algorithms actually reward behavior that rewards lies. lies laced with anger and hate. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. Institutions are coping. I was with, in 2019, I was part of this group of ministers that included Singapore that was looking at big data, technology, and democracy. And it's right now, it's happening right now, this battle. Where is the line between free speech and curtailing the godlike power where the technology we use actually programs us, like the Minority Report, right? And I'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, so June last year, June 15th, this was in Manila City Hall. I was convicted along with, to my left, you see Ray Santos Jr., a really nice, he started as a researcher in Rappler, and he left. He was actually working for government when we were both convicted, June 15th last year, for cyber libel, for a story that I didn't write, edit, or supervise at a time when the law we supposedly violated, cyber libel, didn't even exist, right? And when this happened, it created a huge reaction globally. And this was in the New York Times. The conviction in the Philippines reveals Facebook's dangers. And part of it is this, right? And I'll quickly summarize this before I show you kind of like how does this get to there? Essentially, what has happened is that the methodology of, let's take the meta narrative that is seeded against journalists in the Philippines, against me in particular, is journalist equals criminal. That happened in 2016. So a lie told a million times, bottom up, a lie told a million times on social media becomes fact, right? Without facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. Without any of these three, how can you have a democracy? Without any of these three, how can you have a shared reality or meaningful human endeavor like trying to solve the coronavirus? Singapore, you're in a, we can talk about this a lot more, but I covered Singapore for CNN. One of my first stories coming out was the caning of Michael Fay, East meets West. I enjoyed that with Lee Kuan Yew. So, I guess part of it is, let me go back to what happens. So here, the methodology is the same, whether it is the Philippines or the United States or UK or the Ukraine, right? It is meta-narrative, attack a million times, bottom up, and then authority comes top down. And in Tagalog, we call it bibingka. This is kind of what happens in 2016. The government began attacking us online. 2017, in the State of the Nation address, President Duterte said essentially we're owned by foreigners. Isn't true. And then 2018, we got a shutdown order in January. I had 11 investigations in like 14 months. Cases were filed. By 2019, I was arrested multiple times and I posted bail 8 times in 2019. 2020, I got my 9th arrest warrant. At 2021, my 10th. I've had some of those now thrown out, right? 2 cases out of the 9 we face. So I have 7 cases left. Let's look at the United States so that you can see the same thing happen. Stop the steal. This is data from the Election Integrity Partnership, which includes Stanford. You can see that this is kind of the introduction of the meta-narrative of election fraud. It began in August 2019 on RT, Russia Today. And then you picked up by Steve Bannon, i.e. Cambridge Analytica fame, he put it on YouTube on August 11th. Fox picks it up, Tucker Carlson, on September 15th. And then QAnon drops it in October. It becomes normalized already. You can see that. And then President Trump comes top down January 6th, right? And so you can see the evolution to violence. Look, online violence doesn't stay online. Real world violence. And we know this from terrorist attacks. Some of Carol and I knew each other. I started doing a lot of this network analysis when I was still with CNN, looking at the spread of terrorism. So that's a meta-narrative. Look at your phones. This phone that you have is where it begins because this is the medium, right? On top of this, all the apps that you've downloaded, whether it's YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Spotify, whatever you want to call it, every single one of those, let's take Facebook, because that's my favorite that I've been pounding for 5 years. We're partners of Facebook. We call ourselves frenemies. But when you post on Facebook, right, every single one of your post comes in, machine learning comes in and builds a model of you. Because of how often you post and how many trigger points there are, that model of you sometimes knows you better than you know yourself. That artificial intelligence comes in, sweeps it up, and then serves your most vulnerable moment to a message to a company. That's called the new advertising, or a government. That's called the new propaganda. Look at the trends on the right. The Hype Machine is a book by MIT professor Sinan Aral. We work with Sinan. Personalized mass persuasion means that I can target specific groups of people, whether it's young journalism graduates. I can target a specific message to you, or whether it is, Black women between 18 to 34 in America, or whether it is Filipino Americans, you can target, right? So it's personalized mass persuasion. So your goal could be that journalism is the most amazing thing and you should become a journalist, but you can target each one very specifically to each group. And that's a good thing to do, right? But the hard part is no one knows, no one sees that shift in messaging except you. Now imagine that you're the Russian government that uses this as information warfare, or the Chinese information operations that were taken down by Facebook last year because they were targeting me. They were also campaigning for the daughter of President Duterte, and they were creating fake accounts for the US presidential elections. That is personalized mass persuasion. Hypersocialization means that, have you ever been alone? Hypersocialization means that you're never alone. And in the old world, it would be 6 degrees of separation, right? That kind of has been proven by social scientists. Stanley Milgram did that. But online, part of the reason things go viral is because the 6 degrees of separation becomes 3.5 degrees of separation. So hypersocialization that creates tyranny of trends. The levers on the left side, those are exactly how we can solve the problem. Money, it's the business model. If you've read Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, she basically shows why are we being insidiously manipulated in this way? Because it makes a lot of money. Code. If we have building codes for how to build buildings, you are building structures that change our minds. It's like a virus of lies. And when the virus of lies is released in that information ecosystem, it's pounded repeatedly and infects real people, like on January 6th. More people voted for Donald Trump in 2020 than they did the 4 years earlier. And those people who went to Capitol Hill believed what they were doing. So this is just like kind of the rehabilitation that takes a long time in a drug war, right? It's like that. So code. Norms, it creates new norms. We now live in environments where violence is part of the norm, where civility has been thrown out because what is incentivized is hate, anger, disinformation, lies. If you do any of those, you get wider reach. That's the problem with the design of the social media platforms. They are designed to divide and radicalize. I was at NTU when I wrote my second book, From Bin Laden to Facebook, which was precisely about this shift of how we went from physical radicalization of young men who blew themselves up as suicide bombers to virtual, to the online world. We published the book 1 year before ISIS, right? Because there was a man, a Filipino, on YouTube in 2011 speaking Arabic, telling the world in Arabic to come to the Philippines for jihad, right? So the norms. And then finally, laws. Laws are critically important. When we came under attack in 2016, I believe that social media platforms like journalists would take the gatekeeping power seriously. Well, they didn't. And now I believe legislation is critical. So the two key parts to really look, Singapore is part of the big data initiative in out of Canada and the UK to try to look for the ministers trying to work together to do that. But the EU has the Democracy Action Plan, and the US is looking at Section 230. Of course, Singapore has passed its own. We can talk about that more, right? I'll quickly show you how we discovered the disinformation networks in the Philippines, because we discovered this because we're journalists and it came out of social network analysis. But this was how we looked over time. We looked at keywords. Bayaran means corrupt. Just look at that. That's number 4. And you can see over time, there's a grain of truth in it. It's always there because corruption is endemic in the Philippines. But you can see that leading up to the elections, which were May 2016, it was pounded much more. And then after President Duterte won office, that was when it became a solid line, right? So that's what I called the propaganda war. That was when it began. This was 2018, and you can kind of see, historical revisionism began very early in the Philippines with pro-Marcos communities being deployed in 2015, largely on YouTube and Facebook. Pro-Duterte, pro-Marcos communities came together working with state accounts. These are Facebook. Each circle is a Facebook page. The larger the circle, the larger the eigenvector centrality, meaning the more powerful the account is to spread a message, right? I was very interested in an information cascade. One of the few times early on that we noticed that, the asymmetrical warfare, because if you look back here, right, very small versus very large. Well, one of the few times, this was the first time I was arrested, February 13th, 2019. Most people who realized that shared traditional news organizations. So you can see up top in the yellow, those are traditional news groups, but below, the pro-Duterte, pro-Marcos clusters were creating their own alternative news ecosystem. And that's where, look at Vogue PH, look at that, because I'll show you some of what it's done against me. PNA is the Philippine News Agency. So you can see this. This is February 13th to 17th, 2019. This is the ecosystem. So you remember this one where it was pretty much even, right? And this is the new ecosystem. And this is 2020, the State of the Nation address last year. And what you can see is the one in blue is actually the new strategy, the new tactic, essentially putting a Trojan horse in hyper-local communities. The red and the blue are the pro-Duterte, pro-Marcos community. So you can still see that the traditional news groups are kind of been pushed to the side, and there's a group that's trying to push back, but it's I wish it was a game. Anyway, so what's happened now is the drug war has evolved to something in the Philippines we call red tagging. We have an anti-terror law around the same time that Hong Kong had its Security Act that was put in place. We have an anti-terror law, and it becomes more dangerous to get tagged, red tagged, to get tagged as a terrorist, because you could essentially get arrested without a warrant, held in prison for 24 days. So the world has changed a bit more. This part, I think I'll end here with this last chunk of showing you the kinds of stuff I've lived through online, and kind of pull to a macro. This is the same network that attacks every opposition politician. This network is the attack against Leni Robredo, who is the vice president. She's from the opposition political party. The first wave, this was the first wave, January 2017, was so systematic that they were broken down by demographic. So there's your thinking class, your middle class, your mass base. Mocha Uson was a singer-dancer who is now part of government. Welcome to my world, and I'm sorry for the people who don't eat for the next few little minutes. So I wake up to things like this, my face, the shape of my face, the the way I sound, all of these things are fair game when I get attacked. Because the first goal is to intimidate you, to make you afraid to do what you do, right? When I was convicted June 15th last year, of course, I fought it. I am fighting this in court and I'm fighting for my right to travel. You can see here what they did is they took my face and they doctored it. I have eczema, which is atopic dermatitis, is what it's called. If I don't get enough sleep, my skin gets very, very dry. So dry, it hurts, right? So what they did here is they made it look worse. And then this is the part that I will please, like, don't eat, don't drink. This, I wake up to, like, there were months when this would be astroturf in the comments sections of different things. They called me scrotum face because of that. Human face over genitalia, things like this. When I showed this to some German friends, they just pointed out that this was the same tactic used by the Nazis against the Jews. Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, she was dehumanized in the same way. And of course, remember Vogue PH, I told you that again, they took my picture, made the skin a little bit worse, and added scrotum face. So they create a new language, they give new meaning, they astroturf it until it takes on new meaning. I'm not alone. There are global trends in online violence against women journalists. This report was put out last May by UNESCO, along with the International Center for Journalists. Here, this was a global survey. 73% experienced online abuse. 73% of women journalists. That's insane. 25% received threats of physical violence, and 20% had been attacked or abused offline in relation to the online abuse. It's part of the reason from 2016 until 2019, I increased security 6 times in Rappler, 6 times, right? And Mara will tell you that we gave counseling because this is meant to tear you down, right? The nature of the attacks, well, now we did the first big data study really of these attacks showed exactly what I knew. 60% were meant to tear down my credibility, 40% my will. So simple, right? The attack triggers were anytime I did anything good, or if Mara writes an exclusive story, I get attacked along with Mara. Every Rappler knows this, right? And you lived through it, and we wind up talking to each other. I'll end with this, right? Which is, in the end, this is geopolitical power play. In 2018, using the data that was released from the US Senate Intelligence investigations that was released to Graphica and New Knowledge, we were able to find links bottom up from the Philippine disinformation networks that's connected to the government with Russian disinformation, with the Internet Research Agency, going through Canada, of all weird things, the alt-right in Canada. So there's like a nervous system that has been formed. And I mentioned in September 2020, the 4th takedown that Facebook did in the Philippines. They took down Chinese influence operations. So it was coming from Fujian, coming from China. It was creating fake accounts for the US presidential elections that were supposed to happen 2 months after. So this is September 2020. It was already campaigning for Duterte's daughter for our presidential elections in May. So you can see, near future and far future. And I was so lucky. It was attacking me, and Rappler. So there is a role in elections, and this comes to our elections. May 2022, we have presidential elections. And I believe that you will not have integrity of elections unless guardrails are put in place on the social media platforms. When the platforms that deliver the facts are biased against facts, are biased against journalists, you have a problem, right? I'm going to end with this, which is, this was April last year, when anger, and it is anger, online anger, after President Duterte talked about if you violate quarantine, shoot them dead, was the exact quote. But online anger doesn't lead anywhere unless you take your responsibility as a citizen seriously. And I guess that's let me just go through here and just see. I know I'm at the tail end. I'm going to leave you with your action points, and then we can talk about what journalists do. So essentially, the lies that work the best are half-truths. This was an interview I did with Steven Sakur. It was a really good interview, but if you never watched it and you only read the lies about it, then you'd believe them. Here's what we have to do. You have to carve your area of influence and demand accountability. Stand up against bullies, report the lies. In my case, we are demanding platform accountability. In 2016, we demanded accountability from both President Duterte and Mark Zuckerberg. It is a strangely difficult but incredible time to be a journalist, and what you do today matters. Community, I forgot that last part. Our community helped us survive. By all accounts, Rappler should have shut down in 2018 if we had not done things differently. And what we did in 2018, after the first attacks, after the government tried to shut us down, all of the lawsuits came. By April 2018, we dropped 49% of our advertising revenue. And that was when we kicked into high gear. I took the minds of Rappler, and our economic team, our commercial team, actually found a new sustainable business model based on the methodology of the journalists to find the disinformation networks. And in 2018 to 2019, that new sustainable business model grew 2,000%. It meant that 2019 was a year of profitability, and 2020 was a year where we grew that profitability from 2019 50% more. It was with the help of our community. So I will leave it and try to mute this one now. I'll leave it with that. I think, I'd love to hear your questions, where you are, what are you concerned about?
Thank you, Maria. That was a breathtaking sweep of what's going on in the Philippines and all the courageous things that you are doing at Rappler. It's been a decade of that display of courage and tenacity. And obviously you've come very far, and you're still standing, and you're putting up this book that all of us are looking forward to. But, I wonder whether, despite the fact that you have had this success against all odds, there is also the reality that Duterte's ratings, apart from that short blip in 2020, has been fairly positive, and he's riding high. And there's a very high chance that he will stick around as vice president. So he's not going to get out of our hair anytime soon. He's the embodiment of toxic masculinity. So what do you say to people who say that actually you are the one who's in the minority, that conservative values, law and order are just as important in the Philippines, and there are people who side with him, putting aside the question of whether it's all a case of disinformation? How do you respond to that?
It's a great question, and I respond in three ways. The first is, I'm a conservative. Actually, if you really look at it, this is part of the reason I've been a traditional journalist. So no, I have no problem with political views. What I have problems with are violations of the Constitution, killings. These are like off the scale human rights violations that that's the first. I think it's not about perspective or a political spectrum. It is about tactics and laws. Do we have a system of laws, or do we just have power and money, right? Second is, I think the age of statistical surveys are woefully gone, but I also think there's a gap between old power and new power. And I really saw this in 2018 in Berlin when Madeleine Albright, and again, because it was American, Madeleine Albright led a weekend where we had a conversation with like a dozen of us, looking at, how do you look at power today? Because geopolitical power has shifted, right? But the tools of traditional power, of government power, remain the same largely, but the shifts in power have come from the manipulation of the information ecosystem, manipulation of people. New power, the tech people, don't understand what they're tearing apart here. And the people who are here don't understand that they're like standing on wood that has already been eaten by termites. I think one of the few countries that does understand this is Singapore, but Singapore is going to have to find the path that takes in the new generation. Hong Kong, that's, Jimmy Lai is a friend of mine. I mean, so, but so the second part is statistical surveys, especially if you live in an environment like we do in the Philippines, where violence and fear is not just online, it is in the real world. Mara, our Rapplers in 2016, in July, we were surprised when we had one person doing the night shift, one group, right? So she went out with a camera with a director of photography, a DP. And through the end of 2016 into 2017, one team would come home every night with an average of 8 dead bodies a night. It was shocking, because there was so much going on that one thing just, gets lost. So it's death by 1,000 cuts is what I wind up calling it, right? When you accept it as a new normal, then you're changed by it. I think the thing we try to do is we try to remember, the same way I say, hold the line. I worked really hard to be the person I am and the journalist that I am, and I'm not going to let fear or violence change those values. Anyway, so I guess I didn't really answer your question about the statistical surveys. Let's look at it this way. Even in Venezuela, in North Korea, Kim Jong-un has 100% popularity ratings in his hometown, right? Statistical surveys tend to follow the rise of dictators. And I think we began to see this in Venezuela. I mean, you can also see some of it for a chunk, because Turkey was really the first. Turkey was an interesting country to look at because he took power in 2002, way before social media. And so we've studied a lot of these things. That's part of what I'm writing about in this book is, what does leadership look like in our day and age with this technology? And how do you give freedom? Because in the end, I believe in the wisdom of crowds, which is what a democracy offers. And yet at the same time, put the guardrails so that illegal acts don't impact everyone else, right? It's Lee Kuan Yew who actually said this during the caning of Michael Fay. I mentioned that already. I love covering that story because I was a really young reporter in a story where, it was East versus West. Fascinating stuff. Those same issues are there, but now imagine when you don't have facts, when you don't have a shared reality. That really is what social media is doing. So Zuraidah, when you said, let's put aside social media, you can't put aside social media because it's like social media has become a behavior modification system. That's why I was saying it's kind of like the Minority Report. It's what I mean by behavior modification system. It nudges your behavior based on your behavior, based on your cognitive bias. It is insidious. And if we don't put the right guardrails in place, it will rob us of free will. Sorry, I realized I'm smiling while I'm saying science fiction things, right? But do we not live in a science fiction world?
Absolutely. I think, I want to pick up your point on putting up guardrails. I think you actually speak from a position of authority and you're someone with great influence. You have built up that network, that community that you speak of. Many of us are not in as privileged a position to be able to take action because at the end of the day, not all of us are in leadership positions. Not all of us are able to influence the organizations that we are a part of. So the action plan that you put at the end, summarizing your interview with the BBC, I think was very helpful. But as individual journalists, what do you have to say to those of us who are fighting the battle at our levels?
Actually, so I'll start first as citizens, then as journalists. And I've never taken them apart until I was forced to, right? Because I never had to protect my rights. But as citizens, our information ecosystem has made democracy a man-to-man or woman-to-woman defense. If you play basketball, you can no longer do zone defense. Zuraidah, you can't just stay with South China Morning Post because social media brings it to your community, right? So if you are in your area of influence, if you're fact-based, evidence-based, which is really what all I'm asking for, right? Fact-based, evidence-based. If you do that in your area of influence, and here's a statistic from Socialnomics, kind of like the very first precursor of the power of social media. It's something like 74% of people will take what their families and friends say over what news groups say. So that is the power of family and friends, right? And I say this all the time, even in Rappler now, right? When one Maria or the founders of Rappler can't do this alone, it has to be all of us in our communities. And then what winds up happening is our little communities connect with each other. It's a social network analysis. So think about it, even like everything on the internet. What the internet has done is atomized everything. And in order to have meaning, in order to have shared reality, we need to build bottom up. So that's first. I think the second one is for every journalist here, and I can see a lot of women in the group, the challenges are, this is my 35th year as a journalist. So I've been doing this a long time. And I have never lived through as difficult a time as the last 5 years because, when you walk into a war zone, when you go into, I'm going to say East Timor, that's an easy one. When East Timor was, we had when it was 1999 and you knew it would only be for a short period of time and you could come back out. You plan your way in, you plan your way out. Now we live with it. It's in your pocket. You wake up with it. And so you have to be mentally strong, right? I've always said that journalism has tested me. The reason I love it is because it tests you physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. You have to believe there is something more than a transactional relationship. Because if you only live in a transactional world, that's kind of why you have Donald Trump saying that the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, that he wouldn't do anything. He couldn't say anything against Saudi Arabia, right? I don't believe the world is transactional. I believe we are far too spiritual. And I believe, here's the upside of all of this. It's strange, even as we get divided, what the social media platforms have proven to us is that all of us, regardless of country or culture, are far more identical because the very same platforms are manipulating all of us identically. And frankly, the repercussions in countries in the global south are far worse than in the Western world, where they have institutions that work. Well, not as well as they used to. Sorry. Again, I don't mean to cackle,
Okay, that's a great answer. I see many hands up, and I think I should defer to the rest of the participants and invite everybody to ask their questions. I don't really know who started putting up his or her hand first, so I'll just start by who's on the leftmost of my screen, and I see Arun uh, putting up his hand. Maybe we'll start with Arun.
Yeah, Maria, first of all, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I actually pinch myself to see, it's a privilege to see you in person because, I have read several of your articles and all. To see a brilliant journalist, brave journalist like you, it's a really privilege. And when you listed out three things, you said technology first, then journalism and community. What actually you meant when you meant technology? What the journalist should know?
Arun, thank you for your question. I think most news organizations, we have outsourced the most important parts of the news organization's role, which is, think about it, every news organization uses share buttons from technology companies, right? Number one. Number two, there's so many implicit assumptions in the way social media platforms, which we give the data we have of our people to them, right? Because we put share buttons in. There's so many assumptions that are just wrong. Like, since when is it okay to have 1% lies or 1% hate, right? Or 1% poison? Because if you have 1% poison, the body will die, right? So, anyway, sorry, I get ran. Let me answer your question with what we're doing in Rappler. I believe that, while waiting for Facebook or YouTube to fix their algorithms, to moderate their greed, we are building our own platform where it is fact-based, evidence-based. But the elevator pitch of Rappler in 2011, when I was raising money for this idea, was we build communities of action. I had always thought that technology in my country, in the Philippines, in Indonesia. In fact, I was in Singapore when I was coming up with the ideas for Rappler. And I gotta say, I almost set it up in Singapore because it only took $1 and 1 day to set up a company. And in the Philippines, it took like 3 months. So, and we were lucky. But anyway, so what we are building is the tech part of how to build communities of action, right? So the things that we are doing in other platforms, we want to bring it back. We want to create a place where people can have discussions, because that's what we want, right? We're civil society. How can civil society act in any way if they don't have the facts? If they're motivated by fear, right? Which is kind of, if you look at the leaders that this environment has allowed to win democratically, has harnessed it really well, these leaders divide us. They use us against them. I don't think I think the challenge of leadership, and this is the reason why I became a journalist, was learning, you learn the most from leaders of nations. And inevitably, when you're interviewing leaders of states, you realize that their nation takes on their weaknesses, especially if you're in a country that has a high power distance index. It's a sociological way. Like, high power distance index would be like like the Philippines has a high power distance index. A janitor in the United States, if they see their CEO at the elevator bank, will go, "Hey, Joe, how are you?" A janitor in the Philippines would never do that to their CEO, because we have a high power distance index, unless power changes the culture. One of the things I hope is that social media will help make that high power distance index closer. So sorry, long answer. The quick answer is, I think that there is a ton of stuff that is happening that journalists need to know, starting with tools, right? If you guys haven't, there's also let me talk about some tools that I like a lot, like something like Pinpoint. If you are familiar with Pinpoint, It's Google News Initiative it's now out of beta, but you can take, 12,000 documents, drop it in, and then an AI will crawl through it and pull out people, places, events. That saves me, my gosh, hundreds of hours of work as an investigative journalist. We're also working with OCCRP, which has built its own platform, and we're revising parts of that. OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. So there's a lot, from the tools to the distribution. And the last part, the business model, right? The business model of news organizations are dead. I hope some of you in this room will want to lead news organizations, because a news organization led by a businessman or businesswoman will be run very differently than a news organization led by a journalist who understands business, right? So yeah, lots changing, but I think, what you can do is help craft it. You are part of who will create the future.
Great. A lot of tips there, a lot of practical tips, but I like the very profound line that you shared about how a country reflects its leaders' weaknesses. I think that's a lot to absorb. Next, we have Jane. Jane?
Hello. My name is Jane, and I'm from China.
You muted, Jane. You're muted accidentally. You can unmute. Yeah. Okay. You're Jane, and you're from where?
I'm from China, Shanghai, and so nice to meet you. And I really have a question. I'm curious about. So, what's your big challenge as a female journalism and as a female entrepreneur in Philippines? Because I really respect women entrepreneurs because they have to sacrifice more than men. So, what's your big challenge?
I think the business model of news organizations dead. That was the first big challenge. And in a strange way, I was almost going to thank President Duterte, because when we came under attack, we were forced to confront that when the advertisers got scared. And so we were able to get ready for this pandemic era and get ready for more advertising to die. So the first is, the tasks for news managers is huge. And that goes from the business to the form and substance of journalism. Like, how many of you guys are on TikTok? How are you going to do that? How do you learn the craft of journalism, which is really hard, right? Just getting the story, but then having to find a different form for the story, depending on which platform, the form and substance of journalism. And then I think the third part is managing your own people, leadership. This is what kind of I was writing in this book, really, because for me, you can't be a good leader until you know how to follow and who to follow, right? A good follower actually makes a good leader. And I guess the things that are scaring me about this generation is that the social media platforms are prioritizing, are incentivizing values that are horrific to me. That you are going to essentially, there's this cartoon when I was growing up, you guys may not know this, but it's like there's a devil and an angel on each shoulder. And when the devil gets your ear, you say and do things that aren't so good. And when the angel has your ear, you become your best self. Social media, which is where we get most of our information and where our relationships are, has essentially muted the angel. So the angel is gagged while the devil has been unleashed, right? So I worry about emergent behavior. When you're leading your news group or when you're leading your organization, whatever that is, what's this generation look like? What are their values? Do they still believe in hard work? I think these are some of the questions I have. Last thing, as an entrepreneur, it's easy to make money the goal. that's kind of what tech does. Money is the goal. And part of the dystopia comes from that. You need money, but social businesses, for example, don't make that the goal. I think more and more over time, you're seeing that values-driven businesses now have, and this goes with a rise in civic engagement and again the younger generation, right? So it's funny, it's a push and pull. So yeah, if I really tried very hard not to make money the priority, because as a person I felt like I graduated from Princeton where we had late night conversations. Jeff Bezos was in my class for and we used to have, by the way, even when he was in school, he hated walking to the used store to buy books. He always asked someone else to buy his books for him. So anyway, so it was like I never felt that money alone was the goal, because it's not enough to nourish your soul. So find your balance, right? You can make a ton of money. I've been, as Zuraidah pointed out, I've been very lucky. But I worked really hard. Luck comes with really hard work.
Great. I think Dyresti, you have a question. Thanks, Jane. Dyresti?
Yeah, hello Maria. I'm Dyresti. Just a quick question. With so many intimidation, pressure, harassment, and anything else, what keeps you going in this area? Thank you.
Dyresti, apa kabar? Bahasa Indonesia saya belum lancar ya.
Speak bahasa Indonesia very well. Thank you, Maria.
What keeps me going? Mara keeps me going, watching her stories and her growth. I'll tell you the best part: when your news group comes under attack, all of the friction of running a news group goes away. This happened and I really felt it in 2018. It was almost like all for one and one for all. So what keeps me going is I know that this time is incredibly important. I know it's an existential moment for my country, and we're going to give it our best shot, right? Like I feel like our future will depend on what we do now. And, to be honest, whether I go to jail or not will depend on whether we are fact-based, evidence-based society, whether we are rule of law driven versus power and money.
Great. Thank you, Dyresti. We have Sakura next. Thanks, Sakura.
Hello, Maria. And I'm Sakura from Hong Kong. And since you've mentioned the situation in Hong Kong, and I have a few questions about, first, it's about the fake news, because I know journalism all over the world, they have done a very hard work to combat the fake news. But we do see some of the country, they got fake news law, and some of them feel comfortable with it, and some of them don't. And for Hong Kong, they're talking about maybe they will have it soon enough, but obviously it's not very, they didn't have a very good response here. So I wonder how you see this issue. Why would this law work in some countries and why would this don't? And if it can work, so what's the line? How should it be set? And the other question is, because you've mentioned about the social media, it helps a lot on journalism, and it does really. But also you've mentioned we've outsourced the very important the share button to them. So which means they have something on us too. So I want to see how you balance this, because what we see in the US, the big tech, obviously they got a big influence on the election or on a lot of issues, but some people start to criticizing it, do you need to have such a great power as a big tech to influence a lot of issues in politically or other thing else? So as a media, we do rely on the social media to spread out, influence the news. So how should we balance that, to use it cleverly? And also since you're based in Philippines, but you've also grew up in America, so I want to you're facing Asia for cover Asia stories for such a long period. did you see like, or have you ever think about like there might be some bias from the Western values when covering Asia? So if you really see that bias, so how should you balance this resources you use? Maybe when I quote for example, if I cover China stories, but when I quote sources from US, and I might rethink it because like, I don't mean that their data are wrong, but they have their special approach. So I want to know how you balance that. Thank you.
I love all your questions, Sakura. I'm really so I'll start with the last one and go backwards, right? So balance bias, right? So definitely, I worked at CNN for 18 years, 20 years if you include the years when I was a freelancer, right? But I was working for an American network based in Atlanta, and inevitably their values creep in. They decide, right? So what I did as a reporter in my part of the world. I learned my languages. I learned my culture. I knew that I was standing up for my culture. Doing the caning, I mentioned this 3 times, but the caning of Michael Fay out of Singapore was a fascinating story for me as a young reporter. I was in my 20s when I did that. In the Philippines, look, the one that was most interesting to me is Indonesia, because some of the Indonesian tycoons actually were James Riyadi, for example, you would know was also funding, was also a patron, was a donor, and this was a big thing in the US. And I was like, guys, hello, in Indonesia, a large corporation would have to put money into every single political campaign. This is like normal. But anyway, so I saw in CNN that my task was to make sure that the cultures I lived in was represented. And because I did the stories, inevitably my editor sometimes, because here's your challenge, what your editor does is it pulls it up to a big picture, right? But the balance you have to make sure of is that big picture is no longer recognizable for your local audience. So that was the fight of my career all the time, was making the stories out of my countries accessible and familiar to a Western audience, but at the same time, accessible and insightful to my local audience, right? 9/11 was an interesting story because I was in Jakarta in Indonesia. I was on a treadmill when 9/11 happened, and I saw the reaction in Indonesia, and I wanted to mirror it back. So that was the first. There's definitely biases in the eyes, not just of the beholder, but whoever holds the power to actually transmit. So right now, bias is in the eyes. There is bias in the algorithms that have been coded, right? If you know, there's this film called Coded Bias, where a woman from Nigeria at MIT was doing an AI exercise for class, and she couldn't do it because it didn't recognize her Black face because it was coded by a white American male. Right. So there is bias in everything. And I guess part of it is, again, it goes back to who you are and how you do your stories. That's the craft. It's really tough to do both micro and macro simultaneously, but that's the task we have, and it becomes even harder in a fragmented world. I think that your second question was about how do you, the laws, right? I mean, now I lost myself in it. Remind me again. So after the bias there, you talked, the very first question was really interesting.
Was about the fake news law, because
Fake
it works
news law.
well in some country and it doesn't work well in some region. Like Hong Kong is definitely, like, there are a lot of talking about, they fear about it, especially
Scary.
the arrest. Yes. But like, my question would be like, so why would it works well in some place? So
Okay.
what's the difference?
So in this sense, I look at it from the Constitution of the Philippines, which is kind of a mirror of the Constitution of the United States. So you have to look at my background, right? I do not think states with vast powers need protection, right? The reason why freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of the press. The reason why those were put in our Constitution was to be able to give journalists a chance to stand up and hold large power accountable, right? So what you're talking about as fake news laws are not the same legislation I'm talking about, right? What I'm talking about are the fact that Silicon Valley companies, because of, actually it's partly because not enough of the legislators understood the technology, and then the other part of the impact of the technology, right? The disruption that it would cause. I guess I'm talking about regulating the platforms themselves at the core. Because the basic foundation, look, I mean, there's no way that I would look to, I'm sorry, I don't know who you work for in China, in Shanghai. Who do you work for?
Well, that's a key question. That's the main reason why I asked these questions, because I work for Phoenix TV. So it's like a very
okay, now I know.
pro-China channel, but like,
Yes.
but for the people there, like, because we work for Hong Kong channel, and we know that certain red lines we couldn't cross, but when we discuss it, we will say like, yeah.
I think you froze, or did I freeze?
Yeah, I think Sakura
froze.
frozen. Yeah.
Okay.
Phone just like
Yeah.
it's overheating,
Different
so
thing.
like they just so it just like drop out, so I can still use my computer one. But
Okay,
the thing is
cool,
like you can't see me that way. So I think we have we're facing the problem is like we know that there's a lot of like certain red line we can't cross, and then like so we try to dance with it, but at the same time we all know that like we heard that like people are scared and fear about the fake news law, but think it on the other way, it's like why would it works well for some country, or why would some people feel okay with it, but like it doesn't work well in Hong Kong? So I wonder if there's like the maybe for some of the country they set it to a certain limit which is reasonable, and maybe the one they are coming in Hong Kong have certain like they cross the line, so maybe people are not feeling comfortable with. So I wonder if you have like studied this, or you have experience on this like in different country.
Let me first give you like real advice, because I started when I came back to the Philippines. I chose to work for the government station PTV4 right around the time when I was setting up this independent production team. And look, I think you have to be smart. You have to stick to who you are, what you think is right and wrong. But at the same time, you also know the context of what you're working in. And you have to build your allies. You have to, I say, draw your line so you know when you have to leave, if you have to leave, because that's all we can do, right? Look, I've worked for other organizations when I didn't have as much power, and I've left these organizations because they're not the path I want to take as a person. So for you, Sakura, you're not going to change China. You're not going to be able to, because much more powerful people than you have tried. But what you can do is in the battles that you fight, you stay consistent to the values you believe in, and you build your allies. Sometimes it takes a long time, right? But I was actually like, look at the evolution of the umbrella revolution all the way to where we are today. All of these things, there were, I won't dive because there may be others, but I guess, so the first is know your own personal line of where, you are comfortable, where you're good versus when you're no longer good, right? That's the first. I think the second thing is, in your actual question about fake news laws, I think it depends on the country. Some countries are illiberal. They're just not democracies. And so they will take advantage of the laws to be able to control, to be able to have power in a way that technology has reformed, right? If you look at NSO and the kind of surveillance that is now possible, it's daunting. So this is a really new world. And in that sense, this is where I'll use Singapore as an example, because Singapore is also going to evolve, and it is trying to find a path forward, and Singaporeans are going to help determine what that will become. I am both a fan and a critic of Singapore. I know the best of it. Like if I always say, if we could have had a Lee Kuan Yew in the Philippines, I mean, yeah. So anyway, I mean, things work, right? Is life better for its citizens? And then you have to carve out where your battles are, where your organization goes, and then the extent of what you can do.
Okay, great. We're fast running out of time. I think we have time for only one last question, but I think just to go back very quickly to your point on fake news laws, Maria, I think your first point on it about how you have to ask yourself whether those fake news laws are to protect governments or to protect citizens. I think that's an important point that you just made that I just wanted to emphasize and chime in. Okay, we have time for just one last question. And
actually, Zuraidah, you should have answered that question because you navigated all.
So I just want to give Chenko a chance because I think she's had her hand up for quite some time, and then we'll wrap it up there. Chenko, over to you.
Thank you. Hi, Maria. I'm Sinjo from Bhutan.
Hello,
yesterday when I was just going through your biography, the assumption that I had, we judge very easily. Okay, fine. Now we are going to have a next speaker who's going to be like a Hitler, because that's how I assumed, very serious, and your biography and everything. But you know what? When I see you right now, I find you a little bit very different from what I assumed. Very jolly, full of smile and all these things. And you know what? In Bhutan, we hardly have female journalist who has reached that level who's like taking the post of a CEO or an editor. It's very rare. And then, you know what, maybe that is one reason why we are not very comfortable working with a male boss, because the way we want our article to be, and then the way they present. And for example, if we are being threatened for the articles that we have written, so we get demoralized, we are demotivated, we are not inspired, because they come to us to support us, or say that it's okay to be threatened, it's okay to be, what we say, lambasted on the social media for the fact that you have written, because it's very rare, because I have been a victim of how, when I've written an article on a politician, a very powerful politician, and how he sends his thug brothers to me to threaten me, to even bringing my names and my family names in the social media. So how do you motivate your female, especially the female reporters? Because I maybe I might be wrong in saying this statement, that if you compare a male journalist with a female journalist, we are a little bit softer. We tend to be strong, but when it comes to your character assassination, or your family's name being dragged on the social media for no reason, you feel insecure, you feel a little bit threatened, you feel, what should I do? We get panicked, so we tend to go to your editor for a help. But then when you do not have a female boss who understands you more, who has although boss will have sympathy, but then women boss will have empathy towards you, because she knows what you're going through and what can we do. So how do you motivate, or how do you console your female reporters? That I want to know. Thank you.
Oh my gosh. So you have two strands I want to follow. The first one is you have to demand this of your male boss, right? Because you take risks for your organization, and they need to understand that. And the risks are the same way they're the gains, right? It's physical, intellectual, spiritual, and what's the last one? Not moral, spiritual. Wait, I said spiritual. Anyway, so I'll go back. So when you take these risks, your organization needs to stand behind you. That's one. Whether male or female, that's an organizational thing. And even if Bhutan may be a little bit behind in terms of getting women in leadership roles in journalism, maybe you will be that, right? In terms of Rappler, look, news organizations in the Philippines have been led by women. In that sense, the glass ceiling was broken very early. But in terms of Rappler, even in the time of COVID, right, I would not send a reporter to do anything I wouldn't do myself, number one. And number two, we make sure we can protect them. So, for example, in COVID, right, we're very, very careful, because I know that if something goes wrong, we are going to have to take responsibility, not just for our reporter we sent out, but if they bring it home to their families, then we need to do that. Because unlike, say, Singapore, we don't have a social safety net. So our company, does that. And so we do it we plan a lot. I think women are not, you said I believe women are stronger than men. Sorry, men. Not in a, let me put it this way.
Agree with you, Maria.
Right, we're biased. No, but I'll put it this way. It's kind of like East and West again, right? I used to say it's an idea of what strength is. And I actually was talking about this, when you're tipsy and you're talking about what strength is, you come up with different things. But in a Western perspective, right, they think the oak is the strongest because it looks strong. It has deep roots, right? It has big canopy. So oak. I choose the bamboo because the bamboo, while it's not rigid, it doesn't look so strong, can sway with the wind and will still be there after a typhoon after a typhoon. An oak would get uprooted. Right. So it depends on what strength is. I think you have to have the ability, especially now when as journalists, you're on quicksand because the changes in tech and power structures are happening so quickly. Right. So I think we have to be bamboo. You have to be strong enough to hold your ground, but sway a little bit with the wind. Right. But hold your ground. Right. You're still there when a typhoon or a weather disturbance happens, like bamboo versus oak, the oak will be uprooted in a hurricane. The bamboo will still be left standing. I think women are bamboo.
Thank
Wow.
you.
Okay, that's a very powerful metaphor to end this conversation on. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I think there's so much that you've just shared with us, Maria, that you've given me this impossible task of trying to summarize this conversation. But I just want to very quickly, I think, emphasize the things that you started out with. And I think these are essential values, no matter where the technology takes us, that we have to be mindful of facts, truth, trust, even as we are dealing with these three fundamental changes that you talked about: Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. These are the three challenges. But I think if we go back to the values that we stand for and why we are all in journalism in the first place, we should be able to aspire to be what you have been, the bamboo that's going to outlast the Duterte administration, at least in June 2022. And before that, I think we will look forward to your book. I think the title is fantastic, and I'm sure you'll have many more pieces of wisdom and advice to share with us in the coming months, and we look forward to your book. So thank you very much, Maria. Thank you very much to all the participants who have allowed me to be part of this conversation, and I'll hand you over now to Alan. Alan, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Zuraidah. This session would not have been possible if all the fellows were in Singapore. In previous years, we didn't get a speaker from Manila and a moderator from Hong Kong to come and share, do a session with us like this. But this has been possible because of the unusual circumstances we are in, because of the pandemic. And it has been a terrific way to end AJF 2021. So I just want to thank Maria Ressa for being here with us today, and Zuraidah for making the time to be here as well. So thank you very much.